Good afternoon and welcome back to the Wilson Center. It's my pleasure to moderate this next session of the Wilson China Fellowship Conference. We'll be discussing the, excuse me, I'm hearing myself talk, which is disturbing. Excuse me, I'm hearing myself talk, which is a bit disturbing. We're joined today by four exceptional, very critical issues in the U.S. China relationship, each of whom, I was noted, each of whom's first names all begin with D. This is just a coincidence, as is the fact that my last name begins with D. We will be going to them, though, in alphabetical order, asking each of them to give 10-minute presentations before we engage in a discussion. First is David Bullman. David is the Jill McGovern and Stephen Muller Assistant Professor of China Studies and International Affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where he is also the U.S. Director of the Pacific Community Initiative. His project with us is entitled Implications of China's State Capitalist Welfare State for U.S. China Global Competition. Then we'll be turning to Dimitar Grigoriev, and again, excuse me for mispronouncing your last name, who is an assistant professor of political science at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. His project is titled Hawks and Doves in U.S. China Relations. Third, we'll talk with David McCourt. He's an associate professor of sociology at the University of California, Davis. His project is titled Knowing the PRC, America's China Watches Between Engagement and Strategic Competition. Fourth, we have Deborah Sellingzan, who's an assistant professor of political science at Villanova University. Her project is titled The Key Role of Multilateral Coordination in the U.S.-China Health Relationship. So I will now fix my own audio issues that I'm experiencing and turn over to David Bullman for his presentation. Please go ahead.
Great, thank you so much, Abe, and thanks so much to the Wilson Center, and also in particular to Lucas Meyer for ushering us through this past year. This morning, we had several references to the Super Bowl. Personally, I just felt very old watching two coaches younger than I am at a Dr. Dre halftime show, so I'm just psyched that the Wilson Center still considers me a young American scholar. Before diving into some of the content itself, a little bit of background on the research. So my own interests really relate to political economy in China, central local relations, implementation, and particularly in the context of comparative work on middle income tribes. And a couple of years ago, I started an academic research focus on the economic importance and implementation difficulties of China's, what I'll call a state capitalist welfare state. And I'll talk more about that. But then in 2020, with the tech crackdown and in the past year and a half or so of common prosperity language all over the place, I think this issue became much more policy relevant. And I was a bit surprised or even shocked by a lot of the negative interpretations of common prosperity, not necessarily because I disagreed, but because it seemed like there was a bit of an echo chamber in which we collapsed a lot of our justifiably negative feelings about Xi's authoritarianism with China's justified moves towards economic reform. So I wanted to tease this apart a bit and see what the implications were for US policy and US-China competition globally. So what did the research do? So I explored CPC documents, speeches, Chinese academic literature, global academic literature, and corporate records to see China's goals and level of implementation of what I'll call the state capitalist welfare state in relation to the common prosperity agenda that we're hearing about. And I'll argue that this agenda is addressing some really deep economic problems and will shape China's economic trajectory accordingly. Second, I interviewed formally and informally several Biden and Trump administration officials on their views of common prosperity, just to see if my perception that people were not taking common prosperity's economic element seriously, see if that was just a straw man. And third, and finally, I tried to better understand global and US public opinion to see what effects this system's development would have on soft power, relying on both existing global surveys and original US surveys that I'll introduce in a little bit. So what is the common prosperity agenda? You know, we see common prosperity now in people's daily every day. I think this really started, this big push started in October 2020 with the fifth plenum, even though the ideas were long before that. But last year, common prosperity, according to Bloomberg, was in Xi's speeches 65 times. It's all over the place. And the agenda, according to Xi, is at its core designed to address inequality. Formal content still remains vague. I think maybe the best explication of what's actually included was last summer's Central Finance Commission, where she talked about using taxes and fiscal transfers to support low-income populations, expanding the middle class through salary increases, tax deductions for SMEs, reforming the hukou system, training new skilled workers, improving social protection education, and cracking down on illegal high incomes. So a really broad agenda that's still very vague. And I think this vagueness allows for wide interpretation. And then how one interprets common prosperity, I think it depends in large part on many existing priors regarding the CPC and the Chinese economy. Clearly, in recent years, we've seen economically a strengthening of the state sector, expansive industrial policies, the reversal of many market reforms. And politically, the CPC has centralized power and taken over government functions and become increasingly repressive. So it's therefore maybe not surprising that in my interviews in the US, common prosperity was basically just interpreted as another mechanism for CPC control over the economy and over society and cracking down on the private sector. And this, in nearly 24 informal and formal interviews, not a single official took seriously the possibility that common prosperity would effectively achieve China's stated economic redistribution goals. These interpretations may well be correct. Obviously, CPC rhetoric serves a lot of propaganda purposes, but it's also, I think, important to take the CPC's language seriously. So although common prosperity remains pretty inchoate, I argue that it represents a long-term economic project that seeks to address persistent and deep-rooted economic challenges with inequality and also domestic economic imbalances in order to allow China to become a high-income economy. So this morning, Professor Beckley outlined many of the challenges that China's economy faces. It's unbalanced, it's unequal, productivity growth has slowed since the global financial crisis, there are decreasing returns to capital, increasingly inefficient credit. Despite the poverty alleviation campaign, there are still, according to Li Keqiang, 600 million people living on less than 1,000 renminbi per month. Education and health outcomes for rural and migrant youth are simply insufficient to produce a high productivity workforce. And all of these problems become much more apparent in the context of China's aging and demographic dividend reversal. In comparative work on middle income traps, it's very clear that since World War II, there has not been a single resource scarce country with such high levels of inequality that have made the leap from middle income to high income. The CPC recognizes this, and I think common prosperity requires significant increases in social expenditure to try to address inequality and low consumption. Over the past 15 years already, China's seen an immense expansion of its social safety net, with the share of public expenditure devoted to education, health, housing, and social protection rising from 5% of GDP to 17% of GDP. That's a huge increase that is oftentimes overlooked. And yet, despite this, the overall public financial system remains regressive, and social expenditure as a share of GDP in China is still half that of OECD countries. So the Common Prosperity Agenda has China spending much more. The paper itself that I've written goes into many more details than any of you want to hear about the shortfalls of China's revenue projections, especially related to the pension system. So I won't bore you with the details. Suffice to say, there are extreme revenue shortfalls, especially if the system becomes as generous as envisioned. But then the question is, how will China finance this? On its own, financing a much more generous social transfer system through broad-based taxation would actually represent a convergence with OECD countries. And until relatively recently, this seemed to be what China planned to do. But I think it's now very clear that China has a different financing plan. China is very unlikely to move personal income taxation to levels you see in the OECD, 25% of revenue. In China, it's not even 5% of revenue and not going up. And China's tax-based revenue in general has fallen by 10 percentage points of overall revenue. So it's become clear that one way that China intends to fill this gap is through not a modern taxation system, but SOE profit transfers and dividends. And so the use of state asset ownership in this predominantly market economy still to develop this non-tax-based redistributive welfare system is what I'm calling a state capitalist welfare state. The system has two components, basically. It depends on SOE revitalization and strength and profitability, and it also depends on SOE asset transfers. Now, so let me talk about both of those really quickly. First, in terms of the relationship to SOE evolution, it's of course very common to hear about the state advancing and the private sector retreating now. And while partially correct, I think that's a really overly simplistic view of what's going on with SOE reform in China. And in the piece, I talk much more about three broad directions that I think SOE evolution, if not reform, has taken. One is the removal of the state from a lot of competitive sectors, along with really strong efforts to strengthen the private sector. Second, on the exact opposite side, is maintaining and definitely expanding state ownership of many strategic and publicly focused industries. And third, and possibly most interestingly perhaps, is increasing state investments in the private sector, both as a tool of industrial policy, as we hear that a lot, but also, perhaps more importantly, as a means of bolstering state profits. And if you look at that overall, then SOE evolution is trying to combine private sector dynamism with state control and state profitability. There's a really tall order. It's clear that even if implemented, I think this would lead to considerable efficiency losses as compared to a market reform scenario. But those are losses that I think that the CPC is willing to bear. And this strategy has already succeeded somewhat. The state has more levels of policy control and a new source of revenue. Last year, SOE profits were higher than private sector profits for the first time in 15 years. In terms of the other side of the state capitalist welfare state, China has a long history of intended SOE transfers into the general budget. But under Xi, these efforts have actually become much more ambitious and are finally being implemented. So the piece documents, and again, I won't go into too much depth, but the piece that I've written documents the transfer of SOE assets that began in Shandong in 2015, and then in 2017 were picked up by the state council and then mandated to all provinces. Implementation was supposed to be done last year. It's not. So I went into Chi-Cha-Cha corporate records, went through all of this, saw what was transferred, and about half of provinces have to date implemented fully, and the other half are moving in that direction. So implementation is happening. The transfer of these assets, 10% at this point, but envisioned higher, of 10% of SOE assets being transferred to Social Security funds. If dividend payout ratios rise as intended to levels you see in Singapore and Norway, this would end up financing about 1 to 2 percentage points of GDP and annual revenue that could go to Social Security. This would fill China's Social Security gap. So it's a much bigger deal and actually is being implemented, I think, faster than is often seen. So there are a lot of ifs in this analysis. A lot has to move forward, and I personally focus on implementation problems. So I don't think there's any reason we need to necessarily believe this will happen. But my thought experiment for this piece was to think through the policy implications for the US if all of this becomes a reality. So in the piece, I focus on 3 implications related to economic competition, global soft power competition, and domestic US public support for China policy. I don't have too much time, but let me quickly go through each of these, and I'll try to end quickly. But in terms of economic competition, this state capitalist welfare state implies a much less dynamic but more sustainable growth trajectory, but it also militates against further market reforms. And by boosting domestic demand and enabling more dual circulation and self-reliance, it makes China more robust to external economic pressure. And I talk more about this in the piece. In terms of global soft power, common prosperity and the state capitalist welfare state imply a potentially workable version of market socialism that the CPC itself clearly believes will resonate globally and boost China's soft power. And given growing global discontent with inequality and capitalism itself, the CPC may not be mistaken. In the piece, I compare large-scale time series polling data from the barometers, from the Americas Barometer, Asia Barometer, and Afro Barometer, so 3 different regions, which yield several interesting and regionally consistent findings. So increasingly, there are unfavorable opinions of China, as I think we all know. And yet, despite this, publics in Asia, Africa, and Latin America generally perceive Chinese influence as equal or more positive than US influence. And while China is not the top model for development and comes second after the US, it's been closing the gap. Now, why would effective redistribution make the China model more attractive? So in all 3 regions, after controlling for all sorts of country effects, there's a consistent trend towards more support for redistribution. Those with higher redistributive preferences are already much more likely to see the China model as desirable than the US model. And this correlation itself is growing over time. And this despite China's high levels of inequality today. And in all 3 regions, support for the US model and trust in the US is itself highly correlated with high income levels, high socioeconomic status, and right of center ideological positions. And this is a demographic that is itself shrinking. So if we think about Xi's China dream as not only about gaining global hard power, but establishing China as a global socialist model, this may seem improbable given China's high levels of inequality today, but if the system that I'm talking about is developed, it would make the China model more attractive. And then finally, turning to US public opinion, we all know that recent survey data shows that opinions of China have never been this low, unprecedented lows in terms of favorability. And this attitude shift, I think, interacts with bipartisan policies that have taken a much more confrontational turn. But if China's state capitalist welfare state system is successful, would this change American opinions at all? again, part of the rationale for me asking this was this well-documented shift in US public opinion towards discontent with inequality. And so to answer this question, I commissioned a nationally representative survey of over 1,000 Americans by Ipsos, and additionally to compare preferences between the public and a proxy for the foreign policymaking community, I ran an identical survey for alumni of Johns Hopkins SAIS with almost 600 respondents. SAIS alums predominantly work in government and international affairs related jobs, and over 40% of the respondents either currently work or previously worked for the US government. There are a lot of interesting findings, but again, I'm running out of time. So just to report a few, as compared to the foreign policy community, the public sees China as a strict command economy with no markets that's engaged in unfair trade, and they see the threat from China as related to American jobs. They don't worry about security risks surrounding economic integration in the way that the foreign policy community does. But I also find that across ideological, party, and demographic lines, perceiving China as having a more equal economy and a more generous safety net leads to lower threat perceptions and lower support for combative economic policies. So to further explore how changes in China's economic model would affect these two populations I look at, I added these information cues to each survey with respondents randomly assigned to read about either China's unfair trade, the Xinjiang genocide, or China's goals and progress in fighting poverty and inequality, what I'll call the common prosperity cue. And there's also a control group that got no cue. Following these prompts, respondents were then asked about their threat perceptions regarding China and their policy preferences, and the results were striking. For the public, receiving this common prosperity cue made respondents significantly less likely to see China as a threat and far less supportive of policies like decoupling and containment. The Xinjiang genocide cue had the opposite, as expected, effect, but the magnitude was much lower. And the unfair trade cue had no effect, maybe because this information is already internalized. And unexpectedly to me, actually, party and ideological leanings did not shape the impact of these different information cues. Republicans and Democrats, for instance, both had much lower threat perceptions after hearing about China's redistributive goals, even though their baseline threat perceptions were different significantly. And it's also finally worth noting that the foreign policy community was much less affected by all of the cues, likely given their high information and knowledge levels to begin with. So I think these findings indicate that perceptions of China's redistributive socialism would trigger lower levels of support for policies that are perceived to punish China economically. So just briefly to conclude, implementing this agenda remains very difficult and uncertain, but more progress has been made at addressing poverty and inequality through the use of state assets than I think has been broadly appreciated. If the system develops successfully, I think this would make China more attractive, both in the US and globally. And so despite implementation challenges, US policymakers should not discount the possibility that this emerging system could enhance China's competitive edge. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to hard-hitting comments on this.
Thank you so much, David. I have my hard-hitting comments ready to go, but I want to make sure that everybody has a chance to present before we get to the discussion. For those of you watching, you can submit questions for any/all of the presenters by via email to asia@wilsoncenter.org or via Twitter by tagging @AsiaProgram. And I'll put reminders for that after each speaker. And for now, though, we'll turn to Dimitar. Please go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you, Abe. And thank you, everyone, for including me on this panel. I've already learned so much, and I know I'm going to learn more from Dave and Deb in just a moment. Let me start off by disclosing something about kind of my worldview and where I'm approaching this project from. And so I think I'm probably in good company here, but I see diplomacy as always preferable to conflict. I see conflict as a result of failed diplomacy. I think that diplomacy fails due to misunderstanding and miscalculation, and that misunderstandings in particular result not from fundamental inability to understand the other side, but rather a lack of interest in doing so. In that regard, I believe bilateral public opinion is an area of inequality when it comes to U.S. China relations. First, due to the openness and transparency of American society, I think that Chinese strategists have kind of unfettered access and unequal access to the American public, both in terms of their ability to study the American public mood, but also to shape it and provoke it. Second, I think America's thinking with regards to China has traditionally discounted the importance of Chinese public opinion, not simply because it's difficult to access it, but also because it is easier to envision kind of a more cohesive, dare I say, monolithic China that has a particular position or a particular attitude in keeping with its more kind of authoritarian structure. Right? And at the end of the day, this kind of shorthand interpretation of Chinese politics and the Chinese position may be the right one. It may be strategically efficient to think of China having a cohesive viewpoint. But I also think that that type of thinking and a kind of a lack of curiosity into some of the nuance in Chinese public opinion and how it may or may not converge with the official line could present missed opportunities and result in misinterpretations that could easily have been avoided with a little bit more attentiveness and interest in what the Chinese people think. And so to that end, I have spent a small part of the last 6 years fielding these online public opinion surveys in China, which I call the China Policy Barometer surveys. And what they are these, they're short surveys aimed at trying to get a sense of the pulse, get a sense of the mood on hot button issues of the day in China. And these range from bread and butter domestic issues like support for raising retirement ages, which is going to be an increasingly important topic, to more broad-reaching foreign policy matters, like how should China position and posture itself in the South China Sea. And last year, the Wilson Center was very generous in supporting some of my curiosity to study Chinese public sentiment with regards to relations with the United States. And so what I'm going to share with you now are some of my findings from this effort to explore Chinese public opinion towards the US, and particularly this kind of notion of hawkishness within the Chinese public. And I'm really excited to hear that David is looking at that from the perspective of the United States. And I'm really excited to also hear from Dave about kind of how academics and China hands are thinking about that same question as well. Now, before proceeding, I need to clarify that when I refer to hawkishness, I'm less interested in attitudes that prefer confrontation to cooperation, kind of a preference for fight rather than talk, war rather than jaw. What I'm interested in is the expectation of confrontation being more likely than cooperation. And there are conceptual implications here. For instance, under my definition, it is possible for someone to prefer cooperation, that is to be dovish at heart, but still anticipate that confrontation is the more likely trajectory, given their assessment of the environment at hand. Similarly, it's possible for someone to harbor warm feelings. So David earlier mentioned this kind of favorability thermometer. It's possible under my definition for somebody to harbor warm feelings for the other side, yet still anticipate that hostility is more likely to take place. And I think such qualifications are important because all else equal, conflict, again, based on my worldview, is most likely to emerge when there's a lack of interest, or in this case, a lack of optimism for cooperation. I also think it's productive not to assume that China's hawks are these kind of anti-American or pro-aggression types, the wolf warriors or the little pinks that we hear about in media reporting. Indeed, I think such assumptions are convenient. And indeed, the scarier proposition for me is that most hawks are simply those who have lost faith in cooperation and engagement. Okay, so to this end, again, I did survey work, and what I've accomplished so far is 2 waves in 2021 of comprising of roughly around 6,000 individuals across China, and probing them about their kind of expectations for the future of U.S. China relations and China's relations with the West more broadly. Now, these surveys are not based on representative samples of the Chinese population, and they shouldn't be treated as such. They do capture, however, a portion of the population, particularly the better educated, the more resourced, younger members of the Chinese policy, who I think represent a salient public opinion community in their own right. Nevertheless, I'm going to be cautious in how I relay the sample statistics, and I'll rely more heavily on experimental results embedded within the samples themselves. So these experiments, there's two that I want to talk about briefly today, and they're aimed at kind of capturing some of the emotive responses from the Chinese public in response to rhetorical triggers. And I'm thinking here of two types of rhetorical triggers, one domestic and one external. Domestically, I take advantage of the fact that Chinese policymakers and Chinese leaders are actually quite capable of speaking in multiple tongues. Xi Jinping, for instance, has in different contexts framed the relationship with the West in terms of zero-sum realpolitik, sometimes as mutual gains neoliberalism, and sometimes as a moral battle for traditional Chinese values. So very different frames. And if Chinese citizens are these kind of impassioned nationalists, as suggested in popular media accounts, I would expect that depending on the framing, you would have public opinion moving in predictable directions, with, in particular, zero-sum and moralistic framing contributing to greater expectations for conflict. With regard to external pressure, I look at how Western criticism of China is internalized and interpreted by Chinese citizens. Specifically, I look at how criticism concerning China's economic model, which we spent a lot of time talking about today, versus criticism over China's human rights record is interpreted differently or not differently by Chinese respondents. I also look at whether some more measured criticism mixed in with a little bit of praise for China's achievements could potentially help communicate a critique while also endearing the Chinese public to an argument coming from outside. Now, the overall picture I get from the online surveys is that my measure of hawkish pessimism is more or less correlated with the measure of favorability that David alluded to earlier, which is far more common in public opinion research, but they're not collinear, right? And actually including both of them ends up being useful for explaining downstream attitudes, one of which I'll finish off on in my conclusion. I also find that hawkish pessimists are not the proud, arrogant, emotionally sensitive group that we can cast off as little pinks or wolf warriors. They tend to be people, in fact, who are less satisfied with their government and less optimistic about the future. And so that may have some commonality with some of the pessimism in the United States. And maybe we'll hear more about that later. These general findings are reinforced by some of the experimental results. For instance, I find that most respondents interpret tensions with the U.S. as a non-zero-sum economic rivalry, which I think is a bit of a silver lining. I also find that the randomly inserted rhetorical frames from Xi Jinping do practically nothing to shift these opinions, which to me says that people in China, they may get incensed online, but down deep, they're still basing their expectations on a different set of variables for the future, not based on emotions or rhetoric. That said, the overwhelming majority of respondents do believe that the US and the West more broadly are motivated in their actions by a fear of China's rise. And that's a bit problematic. And I'll talk about why in a moment. But interestingly, again, randomly inserting criticism from the West and from the US doesn't seem to shift these opinions too much. For instance, respondents primed with Western criticism of China's human rights record, they are a bit defensive about it. And so they get a little bit peeved off by those types of criticisms. But ultimately, when you ask them, what do you think is the motivation behind these criticisms from the West? They tend to chalk it off as ignorance and misunderstanding by Westerners. In other words, they're deflecting the criticism and saying, well, we don't really take it seriously. It's just a misunderstanding. It doesn't shift their opinions about kind of expectations for the future. That being said, providing some mixed praise, I find, is actually kind of is helpful for endearing Chinese citizens to the argument and actually boost their optimism for cooperation in the future. Now, what are some of the takeaways here? Well, first of all, Chinese public opinion on relations with the United States I think overall, and this is not a representative sample, but at least based on the sample that I have, which again is biased, it's cautiously optimistic. Right? More people express some optimism that diplomacy might be able to manage competing interests and disagreements, rather than think that the relationship is irreconcilable. And I think that optimism is something that strategists in both DC and Beijing should factor into their accounting. I also find, again, that Chinese public opinion is fairly coherent and pragmatic. And I think that should give US diplomats a little more confidence in criticizing China openly on issues like Xinjiang, Tibet, and other human rights issues without fear of some sort of Chinese public backlash or rallying around the flag effect. I'm not seeing that happening. At worst, Chinese respondents seem to kind of dismiss these criticisms, but it serves a bigger point than just affecting Chinese public opinion. At the same time, I still think the survey findings suggest there's opportunities for engaging Chinese citizens on some positive elements, acknowledging, for example, achievements on redistribution, as David talked about, might be a way of endearing the audience to some of the broader criticisms. Finally, and I alluded to this earlier, my findings suggest that this idea that hawkishness within the Chinese public is synonymous with support for the Chinese Communist Party is perhaps wrong. Right? As I mentioned earlier, the people who are most pessimistic about the future are also the people who are less satisfied in their government today and are less optimistic about the Chinese economy in the future. Right? And the flip side of that is the people who are more optimistic about cooperation, even as they acknowledge that competition and rivalry are increasing. People who are most optimistic are the ones that trust their government, the ones who are optimistic that their diplomats and their leaders are going to be able to find solutions to these problems, not giving the house away or giving the farm away, but still diplomacy. And so I think that this idea that that we might get from just looking at social media or newspaper accounts of aggressive nationalism as being pro-CCP by definition, I think is a problematic starting point for understanding Chinese public opinion, at least based on the surveys that I've completed. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for the time and the platform.
Thank you so much, Dimitar. Very interesting. The fact that those who are most sort of hardcore nationalists online may actually be the more pessimistic, I think is really interesting, and definitely something that we need to think about. Before we turn to Dave McCourt, I'll remind the audience, if you have questions for any of the authors or individually or as a group, you can submit questions via email to asia@wilsoncenter.org or via Twitter by tagging @AsiaProgram. And for that, I'll turn things over to David McCourt.
Well, thank you very much, Abe, and thanks everyone. Thanks to those two previous papers, and to the Wilson Center and its generous funders for this great program. It's been a fantastic time so far. So I'll be talking briefly on my paper for the publication, which is going to be called "Knowing the PRC: America's China Watchers Between Engagement and Strategic Competition." It's part of a broader project, which I've been doing for about the last 5 or 6 years, looking at the sociology or social dynamics of the US China watching community and its impact or lack thereof on US China policy, specifically a shift from engagement to strategic competition that we've witnessed since 2017, or the dating can be part of the puzzle in some ways as well. So the project is based on 133 interviews with US-based China watchers and counting. Anyone on the call who would like to be added to that list, please feel free. I'm always recruiting. In addition to 16 UK-based China watchers, the same number from Australia, to try to give a sense of how the American China watching community works. And part of the background of this project is that the American China watching community is a culturally specific beast, an interesting tribe to be studying. Another point is I'm actually doing something similar on the Russia watch for the Russia watching community, and I've chatted to about 50 of those. So although that's outside of our purview, if anyone's interested in the comparisons between the Russia watchers and the China watchers, I'd be happy to talk about that as well. So common pronouncements in Washington that a new consensus on China obtains actually mask really wide variations in assessments of the China watchers on the China challenge. They disagree on a host of issues. How much of a threat is China? Was engagement a failure? What even was engagement? Was it a thing? This paper, what I do is I map out the distinct positions on engagement and the shift to strategic competition. The paper centers America's China watchers as a worthwhile object of study, and I'll talk about that in a second. You know, why would we look at these folks at all? Against the prevailing explanation for engagement's demise, that China changed, rendering engagement unworkable, I show that no amount of relitigating engagement will actually get us to a genuine consensus on what happened and what should have happened, nor what should come next. So what I'd spend the bulk of the paper doing is analyzing 4 major groups among America's China watchers, a sort of an ideal typical exercise into 4 broad camps on China and US policy, what I call the strategic competitors, the old engagers, the new cold warriors, and the new engagers. And what I do is to try to use that 4-fold typology of different camps to identify some gaps and holes and lacunae, we could say, between these groups as a first step towards not consensus, but maybe productive engagement. So this position as the outside sociologist looking at the China watching community by necessity makes me the fly on the ceiling, and the rather annoying fly on the ceiling, let's be honest. But I think that someone should play that role. It's sort of like the devil's advocate. That's why I hope it's worthwhile what I'm doing. So the first thing I do then is to sort of situate America's China watching community as a worthwhile object of study. I sort of make the point, and maybe this is obvious to many of you who are in the community, the idea of China knowledge and China expertise is really quite a paradoxical statement. You know, how can one be an expert on a place of 1.4 billion people and a land area of 10 million square kilometers, covering hundreds of distinct regions, 5 time zones if it wasn't for government policy, dialects, cultures, etc. So the American China watching community, I think, is a fascinating object of analysis, but not only for pure sort of ethnographic purposes, but it is actually an important input into US policy making. The standard story of engagement demise goes that US policy for the last 4 decades or so has been premised on the notion that engagement and bringing China into the international community will bring about some form of progressive reform in China. That hasn't happened. In fact, we see growing authoritarianism and militarization of the South China Seas and various other disquieting trends and tendencies. And therefore, engagement has failed and needs to be replaced. What I show is that that is not precisely correct in the sense that there are people in Washington, D.C. who would still defend engagement. In fact, they would argue that engagement didn't fail so much as succeed too well for only a certain segment of the American population, notably the very wealthy. In fact, the very administration that was that oversaw the replacement of engagement with strategic competition, one could argue was one office, and we're talking about Trump here, obviously, one office for reasons tied to engagement's very success. So at least what I say is that there is some questionable notions to that narrative that engagement failed. In fact, the political power of the narrative that engagement failed is of sociological interest, one might say. So what I argue is that no amount of relitigating, arguing over engagement and whether it was a success or a failure is actually going to get us to a position of a real understanding of what should come next. One could, for example, have very much understood a shift in US China policy that would not have been framed as a rejection of engagement. It could have been about Xi Jinping himself. It could be about specific actions. No, it was done in a very interesting way which was to do with dismissing the record of engagement. Precisely its obviousness within the China policy community is again of sociological interest. So what I do in the paper then is to say we need to look at the China watching community itself and to think about the divisions and distinctions therein. And what I do is I separate out 4 particular groups. Now I do this not to start a Washington DC food fight, which many in DC like, nor is it to try to get into the which camp am I in, or why am I not included in that camp type of analysis. I mean, for you that you are there. It's to try to really analyze the different positions and therefore use that to perhaps see any gaps and holes and things that are slipping in between those gaps. So the first group that I talk about are the strategic competitors. The strategic competitors seek a new, more hard-headed approach to China. They view China and the United States as locked in a long-term competition, geopolitical, economic, and technological, and they hope to operationalize strategic competition as policy. The strategic competitors had their base really in the Trump administration, their lodestar being Matthew Pottinger, but they also have some people that I think would definitely be put into this camp of those who saw strategic competition as a better framework for US-China relations going forward, including many of the people under the Biden administration, I think would be well conceptualized as strategic competitors. Outside the government, one might think of organizations like Project 2049 and the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments as the type of people who are coming at US-China relations from a strategic competitive viewpoint. Very strong within this group is a military security framing of China and the China challenge. Again, that might seem obvious, but within this group is then some people who might be coming at the China issue from a human rights perspective. And how people might get to the same place on China from different views and from different perspectives is actually an interesting part of my broader project. Now, the second group are what I call the old engagers. Now, I don't say old as a sort of a disparate to sort of criticize, but typically, the old engagers defend the record of America's engagement with the PRC and say against the charges of the strategic competitors that engagement didn't fail and that that's the wrong framework going forward. They are typically more senior with long-standing ties to China, many of whom went to China when it was very difficult to go there. And so they have understandings of China that are very different from someone who may have spent the last 5 to 10 years in China. A generational change is definitely part of the story when it comes to the demise of engagement. So the old engagers often take a longer view that Xi Jinping is not going to be in power forever. And that while US-China relations are not very good at the moment, they might get better. And we should be working towards them getting better. So the old engagers remain optimistic about what cooperation can achieve. The old engagers have distinct bases, institutional bases, than the strategic competitors in different kind of think tanks in Washington, DC, including the one that we're under the auspices of. So the new engagers then are a mid to early career group of China watchers grappling with how to promote cooperation within the new reality of a competitive policy climate. They reject many of the assumptions of the strategic competitors, yet they also realize that strategic competition is the new operative framework for US-China policy. They're often focused on specific policy questions, very much prominent within business and technology. As more junior scholars, they're also attuned to the domestic political climate in the United States. They're very much concerned with anti-Asian hate in the United States. They might be concerned about progressive issues like the voices of Asian Americans and women in the policy community. They are coming at the issue from a different place than the old engagers, who are more strictly policy oriented. The new engagers are a broader group. Remember, when we're talking about the American China watching community, we're talking about a community that has gone from dozens, if low hundreds in the 1980s to many thousands today, as I'm sure the audience for this will show. The number of China watchers in Washington, DC is very big and getting bigger every day. Now, the new Cold Warriors then are the final group I highlight, who take a more strident line than the strategic competitors. They are convinced that China is not just a competitor, but a rival and really an enemy. The Cold War for the new Cold Warriors is not just a metaphor, but an actual framing definition of a global existential struggle for the hearts and minds of people around the world, necessitating the expenditure of all necessary military and economic resources. They're on the same page as with the strategic competitors, as long as the strategic competitors don't backtrack. If they backtrack towards what look like engagements, the new Cold Warriors are going to get off the train. Now, why then do I do this in terms of highlighting these four groups? Well, I do it to try to highlight some gaps and holes. And let me just point to a couple of those. So I talk about what the strategic competitors and new Cold Warriors can't see, which is, and also what the new and old engagers can't see. So the new Cold Warriors and strategic competitors, they take engagement off the table rhetorically. Now, it turns out that trying to talk about doing things in a cooperative sense with China without using the word engagement is actually quite difficult. So you've got yourself into a little bit of a rhetorical trap there. You're having to use terms like competition, which are actually extremely vague and not particularly helpful. So you've taken off the table one term that might be useful. And not only does that, you actually take off some of the engagers themselves. So you're taking off the potential of the United States for forming good China policy, people who are engaged with engagement. That's not necessarily a good thing. Also, what the strategic competitors can't see in the new Cold Warriors, I don't think, is that you can lock in hostility, and you can lock in, particularly if you start engaging in deep and broad sanctions regimes, and we see this on the Russia side. We're stuck in a competition with Russia and rivalry with Russia because we have these sanctions that are not coming off. And once those sanctions go on, Congress is not getting rid of them. Now, I don't do this coming from a particular ideological angle myself. And so similar gaps and lacunae come on the engagers side of things, particularly the fact that strategic competition is a fact of life, and no amount of defending engagement or trying to come at it from a new way is going to change that fact. So the new engagers and the old engagers, I describe the ways in which the challenge now is to deal with U.S. China relations as in a world in which competition is actually the operative frame. The final thing I do then in the paper is to talk about some wedge issues that this sociological exercise has highlighted, things that simply cannot be overcome. They're not going to be just rhetorically fudged, if you like. Human rights, the South China Sea, and Taiwan. And the point about the paper is to try to get people talking to overcome these questions and challenges as a community, not just in theory, but actually in practice. And putting words back on the table might be useful, and getting people to talk to one another over and across these four social groups. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to the Q&A, and thank you again.
Thank you very much, David. As a friend of mine once said in a different context, I've never thought of myself as an independent variable, but I really appreciate your presentation and look forward to your paper. Before we turn over to Deb, I'll remind everybody that you can ask, everybody in the audience, that you can ask questions for the speakers via email to asia@wilsoncenter.org or via Twitter by tagging Asia Program. And with that, I'll turn things over to Deb Sillingsom. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. Let me just get my slide going. So I put this slide up inspired by this morning's conversation. First of all, because nothing gives me greater joy than Nathan Chun's smile at the end of his free skate. And secondly, because I want to make the point that not all games need to bash in the other guy's head to win, and that we can choose what game we wish to play. And so I would recommend figure skating rather than football. So on this, oh, I'm sorry, Okay, yeah, my slides are moving. Sorry, had a bit of a confusion for a second. So I also thought I'd put up a few hearts because it's Valentine's Day, and wishing you all a good one. But I want to start by pointing out something that I think you can really decide which of David's camps I'm in. This seems to be a point that needs to be made, but actually, I think most of the people in the world care about public health. It's not the only thing that we care about, but it is one of the things that we care about. And this seems to be an issue that from the many interviews I've done under this project, many US policymakers no longer believe, and especially don't believe with respect to China. So let's look a minute at the evidence. I think everybody knows that COVID deaths in China are in the low thousands. The number on the New York Times website on Sunday was 4,636. Multiply it by 4 would be reasonable. Early in the pandemic, most countries were underestimating by 3 or 4 times. So, you still get one of the lowest death rates in the world. The Chinese vaccination rate is very high. I can talk about vaccine quality questions in the Q&A and access, but they've really done an extraordinary job of vaccinating their population. The US numbers, of course, were approaching 1 million deaths, and our vaccination rate is 64%, and we are getting really stuck. And this isn't just a COVID story, right? China has done extraordinarily well with HIV/AIDS. I'm happy to talk about that story if you want to. Another example I thought I'd pull here is childhood vaccination rates, where 20 years ago, the Chinese were sort of behind. And if you look at, for example, DPT, which we all know is one of the standard ones for kids, the Chinese are now at 99% coverage for the 3rd vaccine that kids need, whereas the US is only at 94%. So they're doing really well. And so my point to you is, I think we all want good public health. And so the question is really, how do we achieve it? And I want to suggest to you that thinking about how to work through international organizations, and in this case, the WHO, is important to that outcome. So the point being that the World Health Organization can provide important functions in coordination, which I think is widely recognized, but it also provides 2 other functions that I've been looking at. One is to reduce sort of contestation over sovereignty, that no country really wants other countries investigating them, for example, or entering their domestic policy space. And so sovereignty can be eased by working through an international organization. The other thing is that an international organization has a sort of seal of approval option, that by labeling things effectively, by allowing vaccines or drugs to be in their international pharmacopoeia, all these kind of things actually give seals of approval that countries seek. And this has been very effective with respect to the WHO in China. I'm going to look at 3 cases: influenza, SARS, and COVID, to illustrate this further. So just to go over the data, I'm just going to show this to you very briefly, but the point, I think, as you know, is that influenza affects an awful lot of people every year. The death rate is much lower than COVID. COVID has been extremely debilitating to the world. And one of the reasons is that it actually doesn't have the kind of case fatality rate that a bird flu or SARS or a MERS do. And therefore, people don't just hide in their houses forever. And so it spread pretty rapidly around the world, also had asymptomatic transmission, huge problem. But these are the cases that I'm looking at, and this is a timeline. U.S. China influenza cooperation goes all the way back to the late 1980s, and then post SARS, we get much wider cooperation on a range of emerging infections, and especially this idea that we have to be looking for infections that we don't know about. which was really a new idea. Up to that point, there were lots of people who were concerned about pandemic, but they tended to think of it as only flu. I would argue they still think about flu too much relative to coronaviruses, but before SARS, it was almost exclusively flu and not this idea of novel viruses, despite the fact that AIDS was a novel virus. So looking at the seasonal influenza cooperation, I think is a really important example. We go from a handful of surveillance sites in China in the late 80s and early 90s to over 35,000 today. So these are sites that are regularly feeding information on influenza to the World Health Organization. They originally did it through the U.S. Cooperating Center at CDC Atlanta. And then after 2008, when China, under this bilateral agreement to upgrade their abilities, they now have their own cooperating center. So that was one of the coordinating center, excuse me. That was one of the big goals of the U.S. China bilateral. And that's where this international imprimatur becomes so important, that the U.S. could work most effectively with China by helping them reach this sort of international standard. Similarly with providing sufficient surveillance. And so this has been, I think, one of the most successful bilateral programs, one of the most successful disease things. And while much of it worked on the working level bilaterally, the goals were all about a WHO program. And I think that's an interesting model. What's also important to remember is that under non-normal times, where these bird flus like H5N1 or H2N7, all of the United States information in China and access to China has come via WHO teams. And here we get a real pre and post SARS difference. Pre-SARS, the data access was pretty poor. Post-SARS, it's been much better on the human health side. This started back in 2004-05. But even in this past year, the Chinese have reported at least 30 different instances of human bird flu infections. Worth remembering, these are the human ones, and it continues to be an issue that Ministry of Agriculture and Animal Health is not nearly as effective at finding and reporting cases as they are of humans. We want the birds to be the canaries for the humans, not vice versa. And that's not happening. But that isn't a problem with the Ministry of Health or the China CDC. That's a problem with the Ministry of Agriculture. WHO's role here, again, has been coordination, access, and again, recognizing Chinese data, giving approval, etc. SARS. This is the one that everybody seems to know best. It involved, and everything was much slower than with COVID is the big point I want to make here. Several months to identify the pathogen. Genomics was just not nearly as good in 2003 as it is now. Incredible effort by the WHO, both to give pressure and to be diplomatic to get the Chinese to recognize the cases. Huge problems in China where the central government didn't know what was going on, first in Guangdong, then in Beijing, then later actually in Shanxi as well. And it took months to get public recognition for anything. Again, in the end, the WHO was really important. All the US teams that went in, which were incredibly helpful for working with the Chinese on everything from track and trace to identifying the pathogen, went into China under WHO cover. They carried international passports, not US passports. And that's really important. And then the WHO's ability to first give travel guidance and then later to declare the outbreak over was very important. And it was the WHO, not any bilateral organization, that did that. Post-SARS is when the US establishes all these bilateral relationships, did an incredible amount to improve Chinese capacity, which we all saw in the ability to do track and trace and things like that during COVID. And what I think happens is that the US gets used to working bilaterally during this period of sort of normal relations and doesn't really notice what's going on in terms of how these can or cannot be connected to the WHO. At the same time, the international health regulations were upgraded, and that was a big goal for the US. So we get to COVID, and I want you to notice, first of all, my timeline goes from months to weeks, that things just moved so much faster than they did during SARS, and that's the nature of the pathogen. It's also the nature of the Chinese response, and I can go into more detail in the Q&A if you want, but I think having studied this timeline over and over again, that the data gaps for the most part in China were due to actually things they didn't know, including a faulty test that I don't think has been given enough attention, and not to any deliberate cover-ups. But it's also the case the central government got involved much faster. And as everybody knows, as of January 21st, 2021, the government reacts very quickly. They'd already published the genome on the 10th, and they quickly did an incredible track and trace, a lockdown, and they were able to control it within the country. WHO has been the main transmitter of information, coordination. They gave some pressure to the Chinese. I think there was also pressure internally. And as I say, I think they ran into some testing failures. WHO offered a lot of assistance to everybody, including that the US would have been much better off if we'd taken the WHO test back in January when offered, provide assistance to developing countries, coordinate vaccine development and dissemination. The US has really struggled. We've struggled domestically, and I think we fundamentally misunderstood what the Chinese could do. We offered to help them with the genome 4 days before it was published. Pretty sure they already knew what it was. And we really wound up in a fairly combative relationship with the World Health Organization, which I think cut us out of the conversations instead of including us. We also had members on the early teams into China who got some important information on treatment that it's not clear we really paid attention to or tried to disseminate. So I think it was a failure of coordination, not just in terms of U.S. China, but in terms of thinking of the WHO as an important vehicle for our cooperation. So what can we learn? I think in the period when things were going well, we overinterpreted the ability of the bilateral relationship to be effective in emergencies. It never has been. And we also need to recognize that it's the WHO that really makes data sharing easier because it eases these sovereignty concerns. The third thing is that China's public health concern today is much higher, not much lower than it was in 2003. We can see that through higher vaccination rates, a much better response to COVID than to SARS, and efforts to improve health on many other spheres. Air pollution peaked in 2011 and has been dropping steadily since. Food safety has significantly improved. And by the way, the US FDA is now our largest health agency in China by a long shot. And so public health is really something where we have shared interests and we could work together. To do that, we're going to need to think about how to strategically leverage our relationship with international organizations, in particular, but not only the WHO, and to think about how we can work within a collective, but with all kinds of partners, including those that we have other antagonistic relationships. So thank you so much. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Deb. Very interesting. I have several questions for everybody, and questions for coming in over the various roads of input. Again, for those watching, if you have a question, you can submit them via email to asia@wilsoncenter.org or via Twitter by tagging @AsiaProgram. So before we jump into the specific questions, just with the four of you, by a show of hands, do do you agree with the statement that you see the U.S. relationship with China as fundamentally or predominantly competitive at this time? Okay, we're 3 for 4. Okay, maybe a grudging fourth from Deb.
I don't see
Either-
competition and engagement as different, and that's the sports thing, right? I mean, watching Simone Biles cheer for her Chinese competitor at the Summer Olympics was deeply moving.
Sure. And I say that as someone
It's not opposites.
I consider myself a person who thinks that we're in a competitive relationship. I've written a book about it, but at the same time, I've done the engagement thing with the PLA, and when I was working in the Pentagon. So I agree that we can see them, both can happen at the same time. So questions for each of you. And I also wanted to throw open the option, if any of you want to ask a question of the others, please feel free to raise your hand, and we can absolutely have some back and forth there. For David Bowman, on the practices that the Chinese have been conducting lately on their economy, especially when it comes to common prosperity, I thought the attack and downfall of Jack Ma was very interesting, and especially when combined with your analysis about the increasing role of SOEs as a source of revenue for the party and the government. A Marxist would say that SOEs getting more revenue would give them more political power and greater influence. Yet the attack on Jack Ma seems to suggest that the party is cracking down on these folks, and maybe even trying to limit profit motive as a driver of private industry or the political role of the market economy. So I'm curious if your sense is that the party is concerned that these groups, the sort of rising business community, the ultra wealthy in China, are those who are educated and well connected, could become a source of instability for the CCP as a political challenge, and how that interacts with their greater reliance on SOEs for revenue.
Sure, great question. So I think in looking, I do think the interest from outside of China and within China in many ways in common prosperity really started with this Ant Financial IPO getting taken off, and the Jack Ma crackdown, and the general antitrust tech crackdown. I think interpreting any of these moves sort of from a single perspective doesn't make sense. There were these are multi-causal changes in China. I do think that oftentimes we underestimate the antitrust aspect of this, and the fear that China has for economic reasons of the growing strength of the platform economy in China. That said, Ling Wei has had great pieces on the factional elements of this crackdown. I think there's probably a factional component as well. And I think that your point on the political side of Jack Ma and other entrepreneurs getting too powerful for the party definitely ruffled feathers, and also ruffled feathers in the speech he made prior to the crackdown, but also led to fears of potential instability as another source of power that could oppose the party. In general on all of this, I don't want to push against the current interpretations of common prosperity as being anti-private sector, as being a crackdown on the economy. I think that there are many elements within the party that want to use the common prosperity agenda for that purpose. I think there are also a lot of the elements of this agenda that are purely economically motivated from a really rational point of view. And that's sort of the point I wanted to make. So I guess that would be my short response. I think that clearly, if there was only the economic element, then yes, you would not have seen Jack Ma disappear. You would have seen maybe Ant Financial not have the IPO take place. You would have seen more of an antitrust crackdown, but you would not have seen the sort of politicization of it in the same way.
It's very interesting, especially how they balance profit motive, innovation, market forces against these politics. It goes to the central contradiction of allowing market forces into a single state, a unitary political entity driven motivated by dialectical materialism and Marxist theory. It doesn't really, there's always going to be that contradiction, as they would say, in there. And I think your paper really gets to the heart of that. So thanks very much for that. It's a really very interesting topic there. For Dave McCork, again, I'm just very interested in this dichotomy, the groups of scholars that you found. Wondering what you see as some of the external impacts on the changing thinking towards China. You noted a degree of a generational role here, even though you said they're not all the old engagers, but there's definitely a correlation there that I've noted too. I'm wondering how you see some of the external impacts there. If there's a change in the internal makeup of U.S. China watchers, the younger generations tend to be more diverse in terms of demographics, but also in terms of background. They've been engaging with China directly rather than previous generations, learned about China more remotely or through living in Taiwan or Hong Kong. So just curious how you're seeing some of the external factors driving some of these differences as well.
Yeah, I can speak to that. That's a nice question, Abe. And obviously, sort of, there's more that I can just say in response. But trying to capture the China watching community as sort of this dynamic and growing beast, and not simply just the same few handfuls of people. But certainly, a generational story is big there. Sort of folks who went in the 80s and 90s. Had this sort of sense that China was changing in a positive direction, and you sense from them a sort of a bifurcation. Some of those cling to engagement and take this longer view, and some are kind of really let down on a personal level, actually. And you said, if I'm going to sort of name some names, maybe folk like Orville Schell in the sort of the public space would be one who, for a long time, believed in engagement and then feels personally let down for that the age of reform didn't turn out as he and some others in a similar position might have hoped it would. What makes it interesting research is that it doesn't necessarily shake out in a sort of a single way. So you have some people who maybe spent the 2010s in China, saw the hardening of being there on the ground, come back to the United States, and then see the toughening of American policy as causing its own problems. So you see some people that come back sort of arch engagers, even though they were very critical of China on the ground there. And then you get to come back some who are actually come back to the United States and are very critical still. So it's not a single causal line, unfortunately. It's more complicated than that. And obviously, I'm not trying to downplay obvious changes in China, changes in Chinese behavior, changes in how it is to be on the ground in China, and trying to sort of live and work there as someone from the United States. All of these things are absolutely very real. But other external forces are, a more diverse, younger cohort of China watcher. People may be doing it from social locations or institutions that you didn't usually get 20 years ago. So people in the media sphere, podcasters, etc. People who are working for hybrid institutions that are not strictly speaking think tanks, but they're not strictly speaking for-profit organizations either. People in research and consultancy, etc. The China watching space is a much, much more diverse space than it used to be. Lots of different ways of becoming a recognized and legitimate China watcher. Yes, so a good question.
Thanks, David. For Dimitar, your paper and your presentation on Chinese netizens and the sort of more aggressive nationalists that we see online made me think of a phenomenon I've noted. I'm curious on your thoughts on it, that the Chinese government, the Communist Party, does tolerate a degree of criticism of the state, of the party, but really just from one direction. You can criticize them for not being nationalist enough, for being too weak, but you can never criticize them for being too strong or too nationalistic. The Global Times makes a ton of money being overly nationalistic. And netizens are often criticize the government for being too weak or bowing to foreign powers or foreign interests. Yet they can't get away with, or it's harder to get away with sort of the opposite criticism, at least in my sense. It reminded me of Churchill's note that dictators ride to and fro on tigers that they dare not dismount. And so curious if you've noticed this phenomenon, your sense of this phenomenon as well, and if you think this system tends to push Chinese policymakers in a bit of a corner where they have less freedom to maneuver in some areas like the South China Sea or Taiwan because of this system that they've created, where you can criticize the government for not being nationalist or aggressive enough, but never for being too aggressive.
Thank you, Abraham. That was the best question I could get, because it allows me to touch on several things. First of all, I think you're exactly right that there is this inequality in terms of kind of where the boundaries and limits are. Now, I wouldn't say that nationalists have free reign, just like Maoists or Marxists never have had free reign in China. They get clamped down, censored, invited to tea just as much as the liberals do if they broach some of these boundaries. But I think there is more leeway there. And this has deeper consequences, because I've written about this before, but censorship in China is not always explicit. People are, they have to kind of gauge where these boundaries are. Sometimes they overestimate, sometimes they underestimate, but generally people are cautious. And so what you have is not only are the censors and kind of the propagandists more likely to allow hawkish discussions to take place, but then people are more likely to read those discussions. They're more likely to comment on them. They're more likely to engage with them, thinking that it's a safer space to participate in. And so that has then a knock-on market effect, whereby news sites, social media companies, they reward that type of discussion because it gets more attention. People are not going to navigate to kind of the more controversial posts for fear that somehow they might be guilty by association just by reading it or downloading it, right? And so this has this knock-on effect of kind of over-amplifying this more hawkish nationalist sentiment, perhaps above and beyond what the propagandists originally intended. I think that that's a serious concern, but it's also all the more reason to kind of dig deeper and see, is the nationalism that we see kind of in the public space really a privately held sentiment? And I think that some of the survey work that I'm trying to do is trying to get at that, perhaps with not the best way, but hopefully making some progress there. Now, and with regards to your second question, whether this backs China up into a corner, I think that there's a lot of people that would agree with you, including my advisor when I was a PhD student, who I hold in the highest regard, Susan Shirk. She's made this argument about Chinese politicians being stuck in a corner because they can't reasonably back down or provide conciliatory measures in tense situations for fear that they would be called out as not nationalistic and not as strong as they could be. That said, we do have, I think, and this is kind of a literature that I got introduced to as I worked on this project, we do have a lot of evidence that sometimes hawks, governments perceived as being more aggressive, more hawkish, more nationalistic, actually have some advantages in terms of negotiation. So there's this old phrase of only Nixon could have gone to Washington. I think that that's something to pay attention to, right? And Xi Jinping, as kind of the standard bearer for a more aggressive and more assertive China, I would argue has perhaps a little bit more wiggle room in negotiating cooperative agreements. And maybe people are not going to like hearing this, but I think that perhaps Trump had more kind of wiggle room to negotiate with China than Biden does, for no other reason that people perceive the Biden administration to be less hawkish, more dovish, even though that doesn't seem to be the case given the policy environment. These perceptions matter. So I wouldn't necessarily say that the bias that we see towards more aggressive nationalistic discussion in the Chinese media, the consequence that that has on kind of the constraints perceived or otherwise by the politicians necessarily translate into an ability to engage and resolve through diplomacy. And that gets back to kind of Debbie's point earlier, is that you can have competition, you can have confrontation, but you can still have diplomacy as long as there's a willingness and an interest to engage there.
Thanks, Dimitar. I agree that Chinese officials are not necessarily beholden to popular sentiments or constrained by popular sentiments. I mean, they work in a system where people can get thrown in jail because of their opinions. So I think that you would think that that would give them a degree of leeway to put in the policies that they want, that they see as best. So I agree with you on that. And so I'm going to turn to Deb in a moment. We have about 10 more minutes for discussion. And for Deb, I actually had a couple questions. I thought your presentation was really interesting, mostly because it's an issue I don't engage with a lot, no pun intended, in terms of public health. And we heard some commentary from Laura Rosenberger this morning from the White House. She talked about talking to the Chinese and working with the Chinese on public health a bit, and having those engagements sort of turned back on with CDC folks on the ground and whatnot. But I was curious, your focus on the WHO as sort of a good mechanism for engagement in cooperation with the Chinese, just considering the WHO's actions during the COVID-19 pandemic, especially the early weeks and months, where and China's actions with China's initial denials and cover-ups, the keeping WHO officials out of China until the end of January, I think, that the WHO took China's data for granted. They ignored doctors from Taiwan. They didn't declare a public health emergency until late January. They declared a pandemic in March, I think, after it had already gone global, and that China is still withholding information about COVID-19 and its origins. So I think it's curious how you see the WHO as a mechanism for U.S. China, as a useful mechanism for U.S. China cooperation on this, considering the background there, and how China's acted, how the WHO has acted in the past. So I'm curious your sense there. I had another question on cooperation more broadly for you, but I wanted to get to the WHO thing first.
So first, very quickly, a two-finger on Dimitar's comments. The perfect example of she as strongmen being able to cut a deal, I think, was the Paris Agreement in 2015, that he had a great deal more flexibility than when Jiabao did in Copenhagen in 2009. So, and I want to follow up with Dimitar on that, because I think it's something I've been working on for a while. But on public health, so let's start with, are the Chinese hiding anything on origins? No, they're hiding that they don't know anything and they're embarrassed. Also, 99% of virologists think that there's an animal origin to this thing. And the people who are getting off scot-free are the people who deal with animal health in China. And they are far more powerful than the people who deal with human health, because they're much more key to the economy. And so the longer we barrage the Chinese with discussions about lab safety, the more the real problems get ignored, and the folks who are selling all kinds of interesting meats go laughing to the bank. So I think we've made a major mistake that has profound human health implications. As for the WHO did what it always did because it's a relatively weak organization that basically does coordination. My point is that they don't have many better tools than coordination because we as an international community don't give them because we in the United States, which is the most powerful member of the WHO, don't want them clambering around in our labs without prior permission either. And, you know, there've been, so the thing is not that the WHO is perfect. The thing is that we don't have many other options and that we actually do have a long history of being able to work with them when we try and help, and we can help to bolster them, especially on the technical side, where the US CDC and actually now most of the Chinese provincial CDCs have a great deal more technical capacity than the WHO itself does. So we work better when we have that international imprimatur and we use our own technical capacity. On the labeling it this and that, there's clearly a week where they didn't label it as a disease of concern when they should have at the end of January. I think most people agree on that. I've interviewed the former WHO DG, Gro Harlem Brundtland. I've interviewed other people. Some people think that Tedros's hands were tied because of the way we rewrote the international health regulations in 2004. Some people think he had more leeway. And so we need to re-review the international health regulations. But there have been whole Ebola outbreaks that have never been reported to the international community. Countries hiding diseases is the norm, not the exception. And, you know, when we look at what happens with outbreaks of things in the United States, mayors, governors, they're not so excited to report them either. It's no accident that Omicron showed up in Minnesota to begin with, a state with a model public health system rather than the many other states it may well have actually first been in. So I think it's not a perfect system. The interests of any government, and this includes every single local government in the United States, is to hope that the disease will go away with local control and you don't have to report it because you don't want the economic impacts. And then the minute those clearly get beyond you, you suddenly shuffle and try to figure out what to do. This is not a China problem. We have dealt with this for centuries, actually. The reason it's called the Spanish flu is because everyone else hit it during World War I, right? It actually started in Kansas, remember the Kansas flu? And so we just don't have better choices. And actually the evidence is we've done pretty well. And right now we have two jobs we need to do. One is we need to vaccinate the world and we're not coordinating well enough. And I really would like to see some research done on whether following up the 2 Chinese vaccines with 1 mRNA booster would be helpful, because that would get vaccine to go much further, much faster, because they have huge production capacity. The second is we actually need a coronavirus surveillance system similar to our influenza surveillance system. It's clearly a pan-Asia problem, maybe a global problem, not sure, but certainly from Saudi Arabia, where MERS arrived, to Southeast Asia, where we know we have the same types of bats as in China. We need a system to actually surveil, and we don't have that. We cannot do these things without China. We have to work with them. We can't cooperate with them easily unless we have an international coordinating mechanism. That's the WHO.
Well, thanks, Deb. You know, I think there's some pieces we're going to agree to disagree on that, but I think it leads to the second question. We just have a minute or so left before we need to close out, but it raises to the question, I think this applies to everybody on the panel, about issue linkage in a relationship that involves necessary areas of engagement and cooperation like public health, as well as competitive dynamics. We've seen examples time and again of Chinese officials attempting to link cooperation in one issue with a U.S. acquiescence on another issue. China's insistence that the WHO exclude doctors and experts from Taiwan being an example of that. But there's many other examples of Chinese officials saying, we'd love to cooperate with you on this, but how can we do that when you're doing this other thing that we don't like? You need to stop doing that thing for us to cooperate. So I'm curious from all of you how you envision navigating the complexities of a relationship that involves both cooperative and competitive elements, where it's difficult, if not impossible, to de-link some of these critical issues. And of course, there's probably issues on the US side, like human rights in Xinjiang, for example, that limit US interest in cooperation with China on some areas. So curious how you all envision the United States and other countries navigating these complexities. And we can use that as sort of a concluding thought from each of you. And if you'll indulge, maybe we can go in reverse order to keep things as equanimical as we can. So I think Deb, you get the first word on this closing thoughts.
Well, as the former U.S. science counselor in Beijing, I'm pretty used to issue linkage, because for the whole time I was there, my issues were used as sort of the thing to butter up the more difficult issues. And I think the point right now that I'm trying to make is these issues can't just be tradable for other things, that they're actually important enough that the U.S. has to care about them rather than use them as giveaways. We have to work on them, being climate change and public health. You know, we both link issues, and we can also talk about how to de-link them. One of the things I think we need to do in the US is recognize the issues over which we are going to have no influence whatsoever, and acknowledge to the Chinese, we don't agree with you on these issues, but we're just going to tell you what we think. And we're not going to change the internal political system in China. And I think one of the things about maybe those of us who've been around forever in David McCourt's divisions is we've seen a lot of up and downs. You know, I first went to China at the end of the spiritual pollution campaign. You know, so people talk about those halcyon 80s, not always. And the early 90s were kind of interesting. And actually, there's a lot more access now than when I went to the embassy in 1991. So let's recognize that we both link issues, but we're both going to have to try to be grown-ups, even though that's hard.
Thanks, Deb. I was on the other side of the equation as a Pentagon official. I was the bad guy who was stopping all this great cooperation that the Chinese really wanted to do. If only Abe would stop doing all these horrible things. So I think we're on the opposite sides of that one from the Beijing's perspective. And I think next would be David McCourt.
Thanks very much. I'll just say something quickly, which is that you've hit the nail on the head of actually one of the things that divides the four groups that I'm looking at, the extent to which people are willing to turn a blind eye to certain things and sort of hold their nose on things that they don't like. And so obviously for me, the interesting thing is what then we can do to get people together. In a sense, overcoming the question of linkage and delinkage is a practical one of getting people who maybe don't share Deb's particular kind of position and who might want to link and or de-link some of the things together and get them talking to one another, even though they're parts of distinct social groups that perhaps wouldn't want to come together and talk. So again, try to get the China Watching community to work as a community, despite the fact that even among them, there are things they don't want to talk about, and there are things they don't want to either ignore or the opposite. But a great question.
Thanks, David. Next is Dimitar, please.
Great. Again, this is an excellent, thoughtful question. The way I would start is to, first of all, agree with the distinction you made that China is always trying to link these issues. And I think it's worth considering why. It is a more centralized regime. It is one that engages in long-term planning. And the task work for a Chinese Communist Party cadre and an upper level official is linking these things together, right? And so they have an advantage there, and I think they have an interest in doing that. And the US government is just different. I mean, I think we have different comparative advantages, and China has long been trying to link things together. I think during the previous administration, we had a president who was more willing to link things together. And a lot of people thought that that was a problem strategically. And so moving things forward, I think it's important for the US from a strategic perspective to consider its advantages in some of the more compartmentalized approaches to foreign policy with China, and being able to say, as Debbie put it, here's what we think on human rights, not thinking that it's going to change your strategy, but here's what we think. Here's what we think about Xinjiang. And what I'm learning from my surveys is that the Chinese public isn't necessarily averse to that. They understand it, or at least they choose to ignore it, but it's not going to create some sort of huge crisis, right? And so we can hold our values on some issues, but then engage on other ones, right? And we should empower our institutions, decentralized and chaotic as they are, to do that bidding, right? And not try to link things together and not play this game that I think that Chinese strategists realize that they're probably a little bit better at.
Thanks, Dimitar. Dave Bowman, please.
Sure, thank you. So I should not have the last word after these great comments on this. I would simply add that linkage has to do with the interpretations of strategy and relative strength and costs and benefits. And China thinks that, as Dimitar was just saying, that there's an advantage that they have. That doesn't mean that there are not a lot of areas where we both face costs and benefits that would work without linkage. And there are a lot of things we can cooperate and engage on and push back against linkage on. So I think that you have to look at specific issue areas and work from there.
Right. Well, this has been fascinating. Great papers, great discussions. Thank you all for participating in this. It's been great having you as Wilson China Fellows. As my old boss, Jane Hartman, would say, that you're now part of the family, and it's like the Hotel California that you may be checking out, but you'll never actually leave. The Wilson Center will continue to call upon you and work with you in your work going forward. For those of you in the audience, we're going to take a short break. We'll return at 3:30 Eastern for our next panel entitled "The Party's Interests, History, and Xi Jinping." Bye for now.